George Adamski, famous for his alleged encounter with Orthon in the desert. He soon rose to international renown, but as his fame grew, so did the government's interest. Subject to investigations from different agencies, many dismissed him as a crackpot, but Adamski stuck to his story of meeting a man from Venus. Many accuse him of being an elaborate hoaxer. Others maintain that he obtained the best footage of flying saucers ever.
Welcome back to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Eli Watson. In the last episode, we discussed George Adamski, the famous UFO contactee, and his significance and role in shaping modern ufology. In this episode, I'm digging in even further because there is a lot more to the George Adamski story than just him meeting Orthon out in the desert. You see, George Adamski's famous encounter with Orthon in the desert of November 1952 was published and publicized in his first book, The Flying Saucers Have Landed, in 1953. As a result, Adamski became pretty popular. People began to seek Adamski out. They would find him at his Palomar Gardens home, where he helped run the Palomar Gardens Cafe with Alice Wells, who owned the facility and the property. People would come into the cafe to have a bite to eat. They'd sit down, strike up a conversation with Adamski, and talk to him about Orthon and the other space brothers that he was meeting. And it was around this time, probably some of these people who came to visit him, that started to circulate these rumors and these allegations that he was just like a hamburger flipper, or he was a dishwasher, and he was making up these stories to try to elevate himself out of this position.
He had been accused of being a hamburger salesman or hot dog salesman or this and that. All of it false, simply because he contributed to the facility. So for instance, if they were serving a meal and the dishes had to be washed, he helped wash dishes. I go out in the backyard and have a barbecue for my friends. Does that mean I'm a shitty airline pilot now? Simply because I barbecue in the backyard? I mean, ridiculous correlations are made for absolutely nothing.
They'd read his book in which it stated he was Professor Adamski, and then show up and see that he's there helping to run the establishment. Perhaps that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. For example, in today's society, we don't picture typically high-level professionals. No one, certainly with the title professor, is out there washing dishes somewhere. So it's understandable in a way, but they also did not fully understand the situation in which he was living in. He was living in a communal setting. There was a bunch of people on the property. They all pitched in to help each other. That's what was going on. But people were spinning it to try to make it seem like Adamski was trying to get rich off of this story.
George never made a living off of this particular subject. He was not inclined to be a marketeer in order to try to exploit it economically. Yes, he sold material, but you got to cover your costs to publish material and compose material. I think that's only normal. That's basically what I do. I cover the costs of making the material available, and there it is. Some of the books I sell for $20, I see others trying to sell them for $100. You know, it's so. From the standpoint of profession, he was a professional teacher, and it was his students who awarded him the designation or title of professor, not him. And so he never made claims to any degrees or any kind of education that he didn't have. It's not any different than if you go to a martial arts class and the teacher is called sensei or master. Well, is he a master? Can he walk on water or float through the air? Of course not. He's a professional in his particular field, and that's given as a title of respect. And the same thing was for George. They called him Professor Adamski. He would dictate letters and chapters and verse and what have you, and then she would add that at the bottom, Professor Adamski, and he just signed it. It didn't make any difference to him.
I hinted at it in the last episode, but Adamski's teachings and beliefs are really integral to his story, and these really come to the forefront in his second book. Published in 1955, his second book, Inside the Spaceships, which has since been renamed as Inside the Flying Saucers, Adamski picks up from where he left off in the first book. So we pick up in February 1953, where Adamski feels a kind of telepathic urging to go to Los Angeles, in which he does. And there he meets two men, one from Mars and one from Saturn. And they take him to rendezvous with Orthon, and then they go up in a flying saucer together and dock aboard a mothership in the Earth's atmosphere somewhere. Keep this in mind too, NASA wouldn't successfully land a person on the moon for another 16 years. So Adamski saying that he took a ride into outer space would essentially make him the first Earthman to go into outer space. However, according to the Space Brothers in the book, Adamski was not the first, and they had taken several people up before, but didn't name who. So while Adamski was aboard the mothership, they took him to meet this person that the Space Brothers referred to as a master. And this is where we get into the beliefs that Adamski was holding. Before I get ahead of myself, we have to refer to another publication that Adamski had already published at this point, which was a series of pamphlets titled Telepathy, the Cosmic or Universal Language. And in this series of pamphlets, Adamski talks about universal law. Now, if you've been following this series thus far, you've heard that phrase before. Universal law has popped up in my first UFO episode, as well as the first part of Adamski. So, what is universal law? Well, that's what Adamski really gets into. Universal law wasn't made by a person. Instead, universal law existed before us and will continue to exist throughout eternity. It's these laws that each person in each society and every civilization on every planet has to decide whether to follow or not to follow, specifically without the extreme interference from another world. So, in his conversation with the Master, it's revealed that these laws, which can also be referred to as the laws of nature, are what allow them to traverse space. Their ships are powered by natural energy that surrounds us all, and that these natural laws guide everything in the universe, including evolution. This is the kind of thing that allows a tree to grow upright. You've seen trees growing out the side of a mountain and then they curve up towards the sun. What is governing that growth is universal or natural law, but specifically in regards to evolution and what that means for life on other planets. It means that on every planet, in every solar system, in every galaxy, evolution is undergoing the same process that it did here on Earth. The human form is the most ideal shape. It's what evolution is striving towards. We're talking about 5 fingers, 5 toes. The humanoid shape is apparently the apex of evolution. And that's why people from other planets look like us. People from Venus, people from Mars, people from Saturn, they all look like us due to universal law. That's how we all evolve. However, because most of us on planet Earth are not living life in accordance to universal law, we aren't able to traverse space with ease. The Master tells Adamski that there are many things we as a species have yet to learn about ourselves and each other before we can harness this natural energy and join the Space Brothers in space. And this is where it starts to get really wild. Earth was a place of exile. Originally, planet Earth started becoming ripe for life, and the Space Brothers were having some issues with some of their own who did not want to abide by universal law. They were greedy, they were selfish, they were causing problems. So they rounded them up and basically dumped them on planet Earth in hopes that they would develop their own harmony. However, that didn't work. What ended up happening is that these Space Brothers led people throughout history. They became great people, emperors, things like that. And throughout time, the Space Brothers stepped in and tried to reintroduce universal law in order to try to basically, I guess, get Earth back under control and have Earth people abide by universal law so that they could join the rest of the Space Brothers up in space. And Jesus was an incarnation of a Space Brother that was sent to Earth in human form to spread this universal law. And we know how that story went. The universal law also prevents Space Brothers from overly influencing our society. They can't come down and force us to obey universal law. That's not how it works. We have to discover it on our own. Now, what I find interesting about all of this is the parallels between Adamski's teachings and the New Age ideology of Theosophy.
Theosophy was an occult philosophical school of thought that started in the late 1800s by a woman named Helena Blavatsky. And it was a fusion of Eastern and Western philosophy. So it took a lot of elements of Eastern thinking, such as reincarnation and karma and those sorts of things, and combined it with the sort of Western hierarchical top-down structure of Western religion. So a lot of contactee thought sort of has this sort of Eastern semi-Buddhist structure to it. But I think one of the most dramatic examples of where theosophical ideas emerged into contacteeism is when you look at some of the more mystical elements of theosophy, which was this assemblage of nearly immortal, very spiritually evolved beings called the Masters, who lived under the Himalayas in Tibet, as well as in cities under mountains all around the world. And they were tasked with bringing back the core religion that humanity used to have. And so where you see an overlap between theosophy and contacteeism in George Adamski's formulation specifically, in his second book, Inside the Spaceships, he describes a meeting with a 1,000-year-old being named the Master, who teaches him the tenets of universal law, which is the core religion that all the Space Brothers adhere to. It's this sort of common sense philosophy of being kind and good, and it's vaguely Eastern Buddhist sort of thought. It's fairly progressive, non-discriminatory, as was theosophy. People of all races, creeds, sexes were welcome. So there was a lot of overlap there with Adamski, but he also adapted it largely to his needs.
I'll probably explore this topic more in future episodes as I chase down different rabbit holes, but the rise of theosophy through H.P. Blavatsky was really popular among people like Aleister Crowley and directly influenced the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. All of that was super popular in Los Angeles in the 1930s. And if you recall from the first episode, George Adamski lived in Laguna Beach in the 1930s, which is not a very far cry from the central part of Los Angeles. And in the 1930s, Los Angeles would have been a much, much smaller place than it is today. Plus, with Adamski running the Royal Order of Tibet in the 1930s and teaching things very, very similar to theosophy, I find it hard to believe that he wasn't at least aware of the cultural zeitgeist at that point in time. That's not to say that Adamski was teaching theosophy, because there are some differences, and I'm not going to bore you going through the entire list of comparing and contrasting people's beliefs. But one of the big differences was that, like the Great White Brotherhood that Pat just talked about, that's a spiritual thing. You can't go find the Great White Brothers. They exist spiritually underneath specific cities around the world. Adamski preached physical contact, reality. It wasn't spiritual. He wasn't about tarot cards. He wasn't about astrology. Everything he talked about was flesh and blood.
And he made it clear that everybody is capable of reaching that same level of understanding and manifestation, going through your lives, whether you believe in one or more, and doing the right thing and learning the right lessons by following the proper path. You too can achieve mastery over yourself, over the elements. It is inherent within your own being that you can learn levitation, you can learn alchemy of changing elements, you can learn to walk on water. These are levels of understanding and mastery that we are all capable of, and there are very few on this planet for several reasons. One is because as a whole we're nowhere near that level of understanding, and so they come from other places and make themselves available. And so George went to several of these meetings, some of them on location, one in the Himalayas, one in the South America, which was called a meeting of the Interplanetary Council, because the space people considered George Adamski their representative to this planet. Nobody else, only him.
And that leads us into the next, perhaps one of the most important aspects of the Adamski story, which was, if Adamski was truly the chosen representative of the space people, Uncle Sam wanted to know about it. By the end of 1953, just a few short months after Adamski's first book is published, the FBI started to investigate Adamski. And the FBI document, which was released after Adamski passed away, is about 300 pages long. I should also add that it's like a series of investigations that went on from that time period, 53, onto his death. And there is a lot in it. They refer to Adamski as a crackpot, as mentally unbalanced. They did not support him and his claims, and in fact, their main problem with Adamski was one of his particular claims. Again, calling back to the first episode, Adamski traveled around a little bit delivering lectures on the space people, especially 1953 and onward. And in it, he claimed that he had a document from the government that said basically that they cleared him, that they approved that his story was authentic, and that they supported his claims about flying saucers. The FBI did not like this, so they approached him and reprimanded him about talking about this document in any way. And then, according to the FBI files, Adamski then used this interaction where they reprimanded him to claim that they were threatening to arrest him for talking about UFOs. Now, I want to make a note that it is actually illegal to fabricate federal documents like that. So by all means, him claiming that he had an official document from the government means that they should have arrested him, but they didn't. And according to the file, they did not arrest him because he started to switch up his story and started to say that, oh, they're coming after me, the government is coming after me, in order to avoid making him look like he was telling the truth. They couldn't arrest him. This is according to the government documents. As to what actually happened, I wasn't there. There isn't very many people around from that time period, so I can't exactly go and interview people about that, but that is what that document says. But that wasn't the only way they approached Adamski.
What they tried to do, you have to remember that Hoover was hot after the communists.
As we enter the 1950s, we're entering the era of the Red Scare, aka McCarthyism, named after Senator Joseph McCarthy. In the wake of World War II, there was a big China-sized hole in the Far East that was an opportunity for the superpowers of the world. You see, China had been conquered by the Japanese during World War II, and after the US defeated Japan, Japan lost all of that territory in China, essentially making China a new country. They had to rebuild themselves. And the Soviets certainly saw that as an opportunity to install a communist superpower in the East, while the US also saw it as a way to build a democratic superpower in the East. And so there was a war of information within those early years of China in the late 1940s. What ended up happening is the Soviets would send communist sympathizers into these new democratic elections that China was having at the time. The US did the exact same thing, and eventually the communist sympathizers won and ended up creating modern day China in a very, very quick telling of that story. And that happened in 1949. Another thing to keep in mind is the way the US did that, installing people and trying to rig elections in China during that time, was all through intelligence agencies, which were all brand new back then. OSI, FBI, CIA, they were all created during World War II. They were completely new to this game. And so as we entered the Cold War and we start fighting these proxy wars in Korea and Vietnam in order to control different countries about who's democratic, who's communistic, these intelligence agencies are learning how to control populations by manipulating figureheads. And because they knew this, they were worried Russia might do the same. So what we're witnessing at this time period is really the rise of battling intelligence agencies. So couple the loss of a potential democratic ally in the East with members of the Communist Party of the United States of America coming forth and saying that Soviet agents have infiltrated the US government on multiple occasions. Suddenly, there's communists among us, and the hard part is determining who those people are. So the House of Representatives creates the House Un-American Activities Committee, and people like Senator McCarthy or FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover were really leading this witch hunt as it became to find anyone even remotely sympathetic to communism. And I mean, no one was safe. Government officials, academics, athletes, Hollywood stars, they went after everyone. And then here comes Adamski, living in a communal setting on the side of a mountain, talking about space brothers who wear their hair long. They're preaching this non-traditional ideology. They live in like basically utopias where everyone shares stuff. And you see where I'm going with this. This sounds a lot like it could be communist propaganda, and that's what the FBI thought.
And so for a while, Hoover went after Adamski, and he went after him in a strange way because he says, well, you sold pamphlets over the mail system and this and this and this, and then he named some statute. But none of it held together in court because people were selling things and mailing them. Like if you bought a book from me, I had to get it to you somehow. I mailed it to you. How could that be illegal? And so after they stacked up this bogus list of things against him, George said, no problem. Call me in. I will testify in open court. And I will testify to the names and dates of all the people that were also on the saucers and the ships with me that came officially either from the government or the military. Because he was never alone. There were always other guests on board these craft, recognizable ones. And when he told them that he was going to do that, they dropped it all, every bit of it.
And this leads us into the era of the UFO cover-up. It started a few years before this, but this is really where it gets interesting because if you're looking at the Red Scare and you're looking at how the FBI is targeting people like Lucille Ball and Charlie Chaplin, who are like mega famous even to this day, why would they waste resources going after a guy like Adamski, who by comparison was a small fry to them? I think the answer has to do with UFOs. The government wanted to control the narrative on UFOs.
The initial suspicion when it came to flying saucers really had not been, oh gosh, we have space aliens coming to Earth. A lot of people, to the contrary, were very concerned that the Soviets might have a new technology. Perhaps there was some sort of an innovation that was unbeknownst to Americans that the Germans had been building. And maybe despite our efforts to try and get in there and to acquire German technology and German scientists and bring them back to work for us, maybe the Soviets had gotten a few of those scientists too, and maybe had also acquired either the knowledge of or perhaps even prototypes of some kind of aircraft that far exceeded those earliest developments of jet aircraft after the Second World War that the US was building. And so the initial concern around the 1940s and early 1950s really involved, does Stalin have something that we don't? Is this a problem? Are Americans being surveilled in American airspace by incredible aircraft that we can't account for? There was a press conference held where General John Samford actually addresses the public, and he says, there's no evidence right now that these flying saucers, these objects, are anything that are of concern to Americans or a challenge to national security. But there was, during that same press conference, as a measure of being objective and balanced, they also brought in a popular author who himself also a former Marine. His name was Donald Keyhoe. And Keyhoe sits down and he says, holding no punches, I think that the flying saucers are from space. And in fact, that is very close to the title of a book that he authored about this. So by the early 1950s, not only was the military concerned about UFOs and also where they might be from, what this technology might represent, if indeed they are technology, they were trying desperately to control the way that the public saw the issue for fear that if this situation got out of hand and that the public became concerned, that this could be a real issue for the military, and maybe for militaries around the world. And this is really the genesis of what many think of as the UFO cover-up. The reasons why military officials and the government in general, intelligence agencies and what have you, why they would cover up a UFO reality. We don't want the destruction of world religions. We don't want the collapse of society because people find out that aliens are visiting Earth. So whether or not that's even the case is less important than the reasons why the military wanted to tightly control this.
Whatever these UFOs were, the government was and is extremely tight-lipped about what they know about it. And instrumental to controlling the narrative at the time was Project Blue Book.
There were already beginning to be some early, what would become known as ufologists. The term UFO begins to be applied by around 1952 or 1953, that first instituted by Edward J. Ruppelt, the first director of Project Blue Book, which was actually the third iteration of the UFO investigations within the newly formed U.S. Air Force. Prior to that, it had been part of the Army Air Force. So once there's the clear cut and the Army and the Air Force become separate entities, we first had a project called Project Sign, and rather infamously, there was this sort of a report that was produced under Project Sign called the Estimate of the Situation. And that report concluded, look, some of these objects, contrary to our initial concern that Stalin has some kind of a super weapon, it seems that these objects are far in excess of any kind of known capabilities we or the Soviets likely have, and therefore we're looking at the possibility of visitation from space. Now the word is of this so-called estimate of the situation. There are no known copies of this that survive. But the word, according to those who, including Ruppelt, had read it, had been that this document was frowned upon by top brass in Washington. They did not like the idea by intelligence analysts at that time that there might be alien spacecraft in our airspace. And so essentially, top brass gave the order. They said, try again. And so the newly reformed investigations within the U.S. Air Force were known as Project Grudge. This is essentially Sign 2.0. But Project Grudge, as the name would entail, had a much kind of more skeptical attitude. They were downplaying and they were really kind of dismissing a lot of UFO sightings. They were not as open to possibilities as the investigators on Project Sign had been.
Following Project Grudge was Project Blue Book, which had Dr. J. Allen Hynek front and center.
Dr. J. Allen Hynek was an astronomer at Northwestern University, but more importantly, he was actually brought on by the Air Force as a debunker, as somebody to explain away sightings of UFOs. And so he took great joys in exposing falsehoods and so forth, until the Lonnie Zamora case in 1964 in Socorro, New Mexico. And that was the case that turned Dr. Hynek around. And he became a proponent of UFO research and the leading proponent of UFOs in the world at that time.
And then, of course, you have the famous picture of Allen Hynek, Dr. Hynek, turning around his stance of being so against everything UFO, and then he turns around and says, well, maybe I was wrong. And the interesting part is he's using George's pictures while he is making that statement.
And actually, Hynek met Adamski one time at his home in Palomar Gardens. Hynek was traveling with a group of astronomers up to the Palomar Observatory and stopped at the gardens to have a bite to eat. And Hynek, still being in his debunking days, wanted to try to get Adamski to talk about life on Mars, but was disappointed when Adamski didn't want to talk about life on Mars and instead, and I quote, only wanted to sell me some pictures. Adamski was also later investigated by Project Blue Book itself, by Captain Ruppelt, and his determination was that Adamski was a con artist and a charlatan, but not really worth the effort of trying to stop. These fun footnotes aside, what we're witnessing is a pattern of the government trying to destabilize, debunk, and manipulate the conversation around UFOs. And that's not even a conspiracy theory. These are like public records that anyone can access. Like, this is actually what's happening.
The disinformation agenda began prior to Roswell, because there was the 41 crash in Cape Girardeau in Missouri, and some other incidences before that. So it wasn't like the government and the military were not totally unaware of circumstances. But the big publication of Kenneth Arnold kind of jumped things to the forefront. And then with Roswell in 47, then the military stepped in full force in order to keep this information on the down low. The government had to come up with some type of disclaimer, right? For a couple reasons. One, they themselves were not totally sure where these crafts came from. And they were terribly afraid that some power on Earth, some other foreign government, had developed these type of craft, which was impossible. And when they ruled that out, and then the only other conclusion, as General Twining stated, that this were extraterrestrial craft from another planet, and it was General Twining who was responsible for briefing President Truman on the subject. And Truman, at one point, asked if it wouldn't be better to go public. They were actually prepared to print 120 million leaflets in order to distribute it to the public of the United States. But the military, the Pentagon, both General Vandenberg and General Twining, and I'm sure others, they said, no way, that's not how we're going to do things, and that's not how it happens. And so it also shows you who actually is in control of the country. It's not the facade democracy of the presidency. The president does what he's told. That leaves us into the early 50s, the end of Truman and the beginning of Eisenhower. And so the Air Force was designated controller of this particular subject. And in 53, I believe it is, the CIA was awarded it. They became the primary source and outlet for the UFO subject and have been ever since. The government then began debunking this program in the 50s, and what they did is they constituted a agency, what we call the Men in Black. We make funny movies about this stuff, but there was nothing funny about it at all. These were agents that were sent out to coerce, to threaten, and to try to cover up UFO witnesses as much as possible. They did that irresponsibly of whether they were military, police, professional people, non-professional people, so on and so forth. We have to remember that we came from an era where people were more likely to follow orders. All these military personnel came out of World War II. And of course, you had signed the secrecy papers, which are for life, and you cannot say what you're not told to say. And I tell this to your listeners. If you come and find military sources that are giving you information, you have to seriously question what kind of information it is and how it is said. So the Men in Black is the organization that took care of trying to suppress this. And in some circumstances, they succeeded, and other times they didn't. 3 of them came to see Adamski up at his Mount Palomar property there to threaten him, and told him that if he was not going to cooperate, that they would come back, tie him to the bumper of the car, and drag his corpse down the mountain. And George, of course, being much smarter than the average bear, had already been briefed about the fact that they were becoming and who they were. And so consequently, he called up their commanding officer as soon as they drove off, and he said, I know who you are, I know where you work, I know the names of your agents, and if they ever attempt to come to me again like this, I will make sure my friend at the local newspapers, of which several he knew throughout Southern California, would have this information forefront on their newspapers. Then after that, they left him alone. They never came back to him again.
So as you can see, the government interference in the topic of UFOs was extreme. Right out the gate. I mean, this topic didn't even have a chance to breathe when it broke public ground. The government already had its hands all over it, trying to control the way the conversation was going. People like to say that today, the UFO community is fractured and ununified, but from my own research, I don't think it ever was unified. Right from the get-go, in the 1950s, you have a hodgepodge of different people all saying wildly different things about UFOs. And even then, you have these subsets, right? You have like contactees who are all saying different things. And you have different branches of the government doing different investigations into the UFOs. So I don't think the community around UFOs was ever truly unified at any point in history.
You had Donald Kehoe and other popular authors, Frank Scully, who had authored a book at the time called Behind the Flying Saucers. And these people claimed to have insider knowledge about what these vehicles were and where they were from. And in Kehoe's case, he was convinced that they were from space. So it's in the midst of all of that we begin to also have some of these people coming forward and saying, again, not only are they vehicles from space, but they're friendly.
One thing that's important to kind of realize is even back in the early 50s, the contactee movement was never really regarded highly by mainstream UFO researchers. It still isn't, but it was openly mocked and disregarded by the likes of Donald Kehoe and various other investigators at the time. And on top of that, there were 2 kind of phases of contacteeism, 2 different types. There were the types like George Adamski, who met these beings in the desert, walking out of their flying saucers. He rode on their saucers with them. He went to other planets or the moon with them. And then you have the more spiritual contactees who achieve this contact through channeling, where the being speaks through them, like a mediumship sort of method. There's astral travel. There's sort of like a body swap scenario that occurs in some of these stories. There are dimensional teleportations, and it really runs the gamut.
And adding more fuel to the fire of controversy in the Adamski narrative is what's known as the Straith Letter. It's 1957. Adamski receives a letter signed by R.E. Straith from the Cultural Exchange Committee of the State Department in Washington. The letter encourages Adamski for his work with the space people, and it states that the department cannot publicly confirm Adamski's experiences, but that they have evidence that supports his claims. The problem is that R.E. Straith does not exist. and neither does the Cultural Exchange Committee, at least officially. A few of Adamski's friends tried to reach out to the committee and get a response from Straith to really verify if it was true. However, they never did. And their conclusion was that Straith's position in the government was extremely top secret, and therefore he couldn't respond. But this begs the question, if R.E. Straith didn't exist, who wrote the letter? Let's formally introduce two people, Jim Moseley and Gray Barker. Jim Moseley was involved in the UFO community for nearly 60 years, and over the course of his UFO endeavors, he exposed many hoaxes as well as perpetrated many hoaxes. Moseley ran newsletters, Saucer News, and the Saucer Smear for several years, and he is also considered to be one of the first critics to attempt to debunk Adamski. Then we have Gray Barker. Gray Barker is probably most famous for his book, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, which was published in 1956, which, believe it or not, popularized the idea of Men in Black into the world of ufology. Barker himself was also known to propagate hoaxes. Some go as far to say that the Men in Black were an invention of his to begin with. Barker and Moseley were good friends up until Barker's death in 1984. In 1985, Jim Moseley came public, claiming that he and Barker, one night after having too many drinks, fabricated the Straith letter. They did this to see if Adamski would chomp at the bit of believing government recognition, which, if they did hoax it, he did. But can the hoaxer be believed, or did he hoax his own hoax?
The Straith letter was received by George Adamski in December of 1957. You can see on the envelope, it has the State Department seal, not just a piece of ink, it's a seal that's stamped into the envelope. Now, let's dissect this pretty simply. Number one, Jim Moseley and Gray Barker. Neither one of them liked or supported George Adamski, and while they were so busy criticizing, why would they send him something that was not critical and would supposedly support his work and what he did? Secondly, it is a federal crime to counterfeit government correspondence, stamps, and departmental letterhead, all of which is here. It's a $10,000 fine at that time in the 1950s and several years in jail, not or, and. And so consequently, you would have to be quite foolish to go ahead and counterfeit this type of material and not expect to go to jail, because they would have put you in jail. And so they claimed there was no person by the name of R.E. Straith. They made it up, and they claimed that there was no such thing as the Cultural Exchange Committee, in which Mr. Straith was part of. So we went and spent weeks digging in the library in Los Angeles through all the different Los Angeles publications. We came up with a publication, and it says, Johnson spent a night with Khrushchev in the Caucasian Mountains. At the time, Johnson was head of the State Department's Cultural Exchange Committee. So this notion that they fairy-tailed up this whole thing was all a bunch of bull in order to try, once again, to discredit George.
1957 also marks another significant year in the narrative of Adamski.
In 1957, Adamski claimed that the Space Brothers told him to establish what he called the International Get Acquainted Program, the IGAP. And it was a way to sort of spread the message around the world and sort of evangelize the Space Brother message.
But what he did is he recruited a particular individual in each of their own countries in order to be representative through him. So it was a very effective way of communicating with many different places in the world when all you had was post mail. When you send a letter to Japan, 3 weeks later it got there.
And through this program, Adamski started traveling the world and giving lectures around the world.
When George went on his world tours in 59 and then 63, he had such an overwhelming response. New Zealand, Australia, through India. Then he went on into London, into Central Europe.
He was selling out auditoriums in London. I believe Caxton Hall. He sold out. There were people out the door trying to get in. And he was something of a rock star. People really wanted to hear his message. And he got so popular at a certain point that he was actually granted an audience to see Queen Juliana of the Netherlands. She actually requested his presence, and much to the chagrin of the media at the time, they did not think that this was something the royal family should be doing, meeting with someone who claimed to be speaking to space people. Her attitude about the whole thing was that if he's telling the truth, then it's absolutely essential to let him meet with him.
Adamski's world tour was in 1959, and it lasted for 5 months, which was 5 months of near constant media attention. There were a lot of eyes on Adamski at this time, so that would logically mean that if Adamski had any connections to the US government, aka relationships with presidents, that they would have to be extremely secretive.
George made his information available to everyone and anybody who asked for it. And he made that information available to the government. One of those government officials was President Eisenhower. And he took Eisenhower, who made his arrival into Palm Springs. George met him there, drove up to one of the Air Force bases, and there was a scheduled arranged meeting with one of these crafts that came down and landed on the tarmac. And he went on board and conversed with the space people that were on there. It had nothing, absolutely zero, to do with negotiating some kind of diplomacy where we get technology and we give them human beings for experimentals and taking labs and bloods and insemination and all of that. That story is a total and complete hoax, and anybody who has any real information knows that. So Eisenhower and the space people talked, Adamski was there, and they went their ways. In 1960 was the Democratic primary in Los Angeles, and George sent an invitation both to John Kennedy and to Richard Nixon. Nixon declined. Kennedy got in the limo and drove down here to Vista and met with him. They became friends. And so when Kennedy became elected, he gave George what's called a ordnance card, or which allows him access to the White House to be used through the underground entrances. So in other words, dignitaries and things like that don't mind being seen, or they want to be seen, come through the East Wing doors or what have you, and so they can get their picture taken and logged in. But there is a plethora of people who come in through the underground entrances that conduct all kinds of other kind of business in the White House that they don't necessarily want the general public to know about. George had one of those cards, and he went on several visits to the White House, one in 62, one in 63, at least that I can talk about, and had talks with John Kennedy in private. So what happened was, Adamski met Kennedy out there in the same area, Desert Hot Springs, which is right next to Palm Springs. Him and the Attorney General, Bobby, in the car drove to, this time, a different military base and had the same kind of meeting. The craft landed on the tarmac, they drove up to it, John Kennedy got out, went into the spacecraft, and he had the conversation, and then they did the reversal going home. So Adamski was present for two of those introductions. Quite a bit of information changed hands about all sorts of things.
George's final book is published in 1961, titled Flying Saucers Farewell. And the first chunk of the book discusses a lot of the controversy that had arisen around him during the time. A lot of that I've already discussed. Some of it I haven't even brought up because I just don't have the time to get into all of it. The second half of the book covers his world tour, which I'm not going to go into every single detail about. However, even though that was his last book, that is certainly not everything left to talk about Adamski, as there are a few more major events in his life. So in 1963, Adamski returns to Europe, paid for and funded by the IGAP. There he meets up with his co-workers May Morlaix and Lou Zinstag. And this is the trip where he claims to have met the Pope. So with May and Lou, he visits the Vatican. And there in front of the Vatican, as the story goes, he claims he sees someone. He says, "That's my guy." Lou and May have to stay back while Adamski goes and turns behind a corner out of their view. Adamski returns an hour later saying that he met the Pope and that the Pope gave him this coin as evidence that they had indeed met. Like with anything Adamski, this claim is also covered in controversy. Many are not happy with the way the story looks. Obviously, Lou and May did not actually witness him meeting the Pope. In fact, there were no witnesses except for whoever the Pope Guard was and the Pope himself, who passed away a few days after Adamski's alleged visit. So not much to go off of in terms of verifying those claims. And as for the coin itself, that is often called into question. Some calling it just a simple gift shop trinket, which I don't believe it is, and others saying that it is a more exclusive coin that had been purchased, but not given to him by the Pope himself. What's really neat is I've actually held that coin in my hand. I met Glenn at the Oak Knoll campground, which is where Palomar Gardens used to be. And Glenn brought that coin and I got to see it with my own eyes. That was a pretty rad moment of holding history in my hand. Whichever version of history you want to believe, I still held the coin. And that's definitely a moment I can brag about a little bit. So now we're into the 1960s. By this point, Adamski was in his 70s. He's probably slowing down a little bit. And as the world began to change and we're entering the space race, people's conceptions about space began to change. The concept of space travel was no longer a fanciful one. It was something that was unfolding before the American public. So people's opinions began to change.
Towards the end of his life, Adamski's fame was definitely on the wane. He still had hardcore fans, and he still has hardcore fans. The issue is that those are sort of the only fans he had left. He was not selling out auditoriums anymore by the mid-60s. He wasn't meeting with presidents and queens. He was giving small talks in people's living rooms. Now, there are probably many factors that go into his decreasing popularity. First might be that he was simply getting old and he wasn't as dynamic as he used to be. But I think the main issue is that in the early 1950s, people hadn't been to space and they didn't know what was out there. They didn't know what Mars was like, or Mercury or Venus. They didn't know what space was like. But by the mid-60s, they'd seen the Gemini program, the Mercury program. They were 4 years away from man landing on the moon. They knew that big rockets shooting lots of fire and these astronauts in pressure suits, they knew what space travel looked like now. And they knew things about Venus and Mars and their inhospitability that made Adamski's stories seem somewhat quaint. As people became more savvy about what outer space was like, Adamski's stories got more and more fantastic and kind of less believable. And that's where he started losing all but his most ardent followers. It's somewhat plausible in a certain way for a man to meet another man from Venus in the desert, coming out of a flying saucer. That's one thing. But when this guy is suddenly the ambassador of Earth, flying on a mothership to Saturn for an interplanetary conference, that gets a little harder to swallow for a lot of people. And ironically, as his stories got more and more fantastic, they also got more and more mundane. They became less about the alien aspect and more about his philosophy, his universal law, which is not a bad philosophy, but it's pretty dry. It's not a very exciting thing to lecture about for 2 hours. It's not something that people are going to want to listen to. And then on top of that, you had sort of the diffusion of the contactee message, because he was first out of the gate in 1952, and he really sucked all the oxygen out of the room. But by 1965, you had, George Van Tassel doing his massive giant rock conventions. You had George King of the Aetherius Society, Daniel Fry, Orfeo Angelucci, Dana Howard, Truman Bethlehem. You had all these other contactees, and they all had their own stories and their own experiences and their own philosophies. And some of those stories were just more interesting. And so I think people were getting their contactee fix in other places, which is also not to say that the whole contactee movement was also on the wane, because the things that held true for Adamski also held true for these people.
The 1960s also saw an increase in the popularity of the abduction phenomena. And this really takes the UFO narrative by storm.
I think the final nail in the coffin for the contactee movement was when another narrative emerged that was just way more exciting, and that was the alien abduction narrative, starting in the early 60s with Betty and Barney Hill. And these experiences were not kind, they were not fuzzy, they were not warm. They were much more horrific, they're traumatic. People didn't remember them consciously, and these memories had to be drawn out of them. They were not human aliens, they were alien aliens.
These were real experiences to the experiencer that often terrified them, that often they had bad dreams, they had trauma, psychological issues based on these experiences. And it seems like there were much more than just this happy feeling of contactee and space brothers and love and peace and all that. This was sort of a real, personal, terrifying experience for the abductee.
I don't know what this says about human nature, but I think it's a much more plausible story because it's something that we can relate to. It's easy to sort of transpose the idea of, humans capturing a black bear in the wild and tagging it. And then the bear's like, what happened? As opposed to, we go out in the woods and we sit down with the bear and discuss life philosophy with them. Like that doesn't quite gel in the same way. It doesn't have the immediacy that the abduction narrative has.
However, Adamski was very much against the abduction phenomena, insisting that it was part of the government's plan to suppress the truth about flying saucers. And up until 1961, the idea of the UFO contactee was pretty mainstream.
61, it went totally divergent into a completely fear-based, harm-based, aggressive-based projection. And this particular projection was the filament for what the government was doing. In the 1950s, these craft landed among the general public, and there was interaction with regular people. Our government officials couldn't control it. So they decided to develop a psychological program, which is basically Psychology 101, use fear to scare the heck out of people. And this is going to change the entire emphasis of contacts. Because prior to that time, when people were polled and asked if one of these ships would land, would you be inclined to go there and see what it's about or have interaction? And the majority said yes. After 1961, and through the 60s into the 70s, that whole stigma changed. And when polled, the people said, oh no, we're not going to go there. We're going to get our guns and we're going to shoot or do whatever. And so the powers that be very cleverly managed to influence face-to-face, person-to-person contact and make it into something that people weren't willing to do anymore.
Now, the last major point I want to touch on in terms of the Adamski narrative is his films. In addition to photographs, Adamski also started to take video footage of flying saucers. And this started in about the mid-1950s after the publication of his first book. And he got footage in California, in Mexico, in Wisconsin, and on the East Coast. Now, I don't want to go through every single piece of Adamski's footage. I think it would take too long and might not be the most exciting thing to watch, because there's certainly a lot of it out there. But I do want to talk about the major one that's often discussed when referring to Adamski's body of evidence, which is the Silver Springs footage. In the 1960s, Adamski began to visit the East Coast a lot more frequently. In 1963, he meets the Steckling family, which he ends up staying with several times and becoming good friends with. And at some point in 1964, he meets a woman named Madeline Rotifer, and she helped organize different lectures for him along the East Coast. And they were friends, and he stayed with her on several occasions. She lived in Silver Springs, Maryland. And it was on one of these occasions where he was staying with her that a very startling event occurred.
But on February 26th, approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, a space friend, contact of Mr. Adamski, came to this house. I was still asleep, but when I got up, Mr. Adamski told me that he had been told that we should get cameras ready for filming later in the day. And we waited. Now, they did not tell him what time they were coming, but this was earlier in the morning, but this was middle of the afternoon, about 3:30, when we noticed them at a distance. And we were at the dining room window looking out, and they came in closer. And by the way, 3 more spacemen came and knocked at the door just before the incident. And Mr. Adamski went, and they told him they said, "Get your cameras ready, they're coming." Now that is how close he was associated with those people from other planets. And it's difficult to believe, but they looked just like American. One of them had brown hair, and one had dark hair, and one had slightly gray hair. And they parked in a car. I believe it was an Oldsmobile, but I don't know the year, down here at the street when they came. And then the spaceship came, and we went outside, but I had a broken leg. I had fallen the month before in my living room, and I was in a walking cast. And but I was able to walk around, but with a little limping difficulties, but I did get around. And but when we came out on the porch up here and started to film, he told me to film, and he was going to film. I said, "George, I can't do this. I'm too wobbly." And I had not had the camera but 2 months. My husband had given it to me for Christmas just 2 months before. So I handed him, he said, "Okay, I'll do it." So I gave him my camera, and he laid his down, and he filmed it then. I started, but I wasn't sure of myself, and I didn't want to miss it. So I gave the camera to him, and he finished filming it. But I was, pumping around in the background and able to walk, of course, without too much difficulty with his cast on. But they only stayed about approximately 10 minutes. They did not land. They did not get out of the spacecraft, but there were glimpses of people through the round windows. And they maneuvered. They came in here. It was a low humming and a low swishing sound. And they came in, when they got close here, they came in very slowly. And it was round, and there were 3 of these, about this size, I guess, these landing gears underneath, and they were going like this, retracting in and out. And they told George later it was for stabilization. If they'd put all of them out, they would have had to land. And they kept one retracted all the time, and the other 2 were going in and out. But they were demonstrating, they wanted him to capture this on film, their abilities to do certain maneuvers. And they wanted him to have this proof to show the people of the world, because our world governments have better film, and they haven't shared any of them with us.
The footage itself is strange. The craft lurches from side to side. Sometimes it feels like it's even moving with the camera. It's absolutely nothing like you would expect how one of these crafts would fly, especially not after the way Adamski described it in the first book. Obviously, this is another source of controversy for Adamski. People were very, very quick to hop on this and be like, this is a hoax. And honestly, when I look at it, it almost looks like they're dangling something in front of the camera. I don't think that's what it is because of the way it moves. As for what it is, if it's not an actual UFO, I don't know. However, I don't want to get too ahead of myself. I'm going to let Glenn handle the analysis, and I'll let you guys make up your own minds about it.
Silver Springs, the first thing that happened, and this was February 26th of 1965, is one of these, what we call a registering disc, or a remote control, or what you would call a drone now, was sent down, and you can see on the film that it moves in between the trees and measures the distance horizontally and vertically. And this was fed directly into the computer in the larger ship so that when it came down, it could mime the same motions without hitting any of the obstructions. And here's the other shot that's even better because it's behind the tree. So, that takes out any fakery that people make claims of. So here's one of the pictures of the frames from the original frame of the motion picture films of Silver Springs. And you can see very clearly the three-dimensionality of the craft, because as you come around here, this corner turns the corner in which the porthole gets smaller because it goes into a different angle. And what happens is this craft gives off, due to its propulsion system, which runs through a ball, a sphere on the top and through the bottom. This is a magnetic pole like you would have on the planet. It runs the same way as a Van de Graaff generator. And it also, the propulsion system, gives off a static electricity, a charge. And that electricity comes through the pores of the ship. What makes it the fact that it cannot be a model, because you see the visual distortion from the energy field that's around the ship. So now when you go to the next photo, you can see there's an oblongation, right? You can see quite clearly the four portholes. You can also see that one of the three ball condensers, you can see the faint outline here, is being retracted and extended as it moves along the frame. And so there, and you can see the elliptical distortion on the hull itself. And it's very much the same as if you take your car and go into the desert in the hot sun and you park it and then walk away 50 yards and then look at it. It looks quite different. You walk away another 50 yards and look at it, and it doesn't even look like a car at all. It looks like just a shimmering heat wave, because the radiation from the sun is bouncing against the metal and reflecting back up, and consequently that radiation signature is there. And that is one of the strengths of Adamski's pictures. They all have biometric radiation signatures, which cannot be duplicated on a model.
So the Silver Springs footage was shot in February 1965. A few short months later, in April of that year, Adamski suffered a heart attack and passed away. Adamski was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, which is reserved for veterans, which Adamski was. But before he passed away, Adamski talked to Fred Steckling about the formation of what's known as the George Adamski Foundation.
And he was coming towards the end of his life. And his last birthday in our house, we celebrated the birthday with him, and he handed my father his briefcase and he said, "I will be passing away soon and I want you to continue the work." And my father was totally flabbergasted. He said to him, "My God, what do you mean you're going to be leaving?" And he said, "Because I can feel that the end is coming soon, and I want to make sure that this subject doesn't fade into nothingness after I'm gone, because that's how easy it is. People lose focus and emphasis and go their own direction, and there's often infighting and all this other nonsense. And there was some of that too, but we managed to maintain a cohesive a program, foundation, and work, even though some of that did happen on the fringes. And so we have maintained the reality and the authenticity ever since. The story has never changed.
Now, I want to take a moment here to thank Glenn Steckling for providing so much material for these two documentaries, as well as taking so much time to answer my questions and provide multiple interviews. I mean, the George Adamski Foundation is the go-to place for information on George Adamski, and these 2 documentaries would not have been possible without Glenn. This is a big shout out to you, Glenn. Thank you very much for all your help. However, I still have a question. What does it all mean? What's it all about? What's it all for? The things Adamski talks about are not at the forefront of UFO conversation these days. They're just not. So why talk about it? Why even discuss it? I could use like a cop-out answer, which is that, oh, well, he's historically important, which he is. You can't separate George Adamski from the history of UFOs. You can't talk about UFOs without talking about George Adamski in some regard. I mean, people point to Adamski's photos and say fake, okay? People point to the story of meeting Orthon and then his various books after that and say bogus. Okay, fine. But what else is there? And that, to me, is what Adamski was trying to do. The underlying message of it all, Space Brothers aside, is one of positivity. That people can get better. That the ultimate destiny for mankind was to live in harmony with each other and, go to space. But I think that hopefulness is something that the world needed then and the world still needs today. It's a very positive message, and I think all of that gets obscured in the controversy of who was telling the truth and who's not telling the truth, and oh, it's fake images and they're fake videos. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that's just the hook. And that wasn't the main thing he was here to discuss. He was here to talk about how we can get better. And of course, his ideology was very counterculture. Even by today's standards, I think it would be a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow, but you can't blame him for trying.
I like to think that Adamski was something of a proto-hippie. People don't seem to agree with me on that, but I stand by it because his message really reflected the sort of peace movement of the late 60s. And he lived in a communal sort of setting on Mount Palomar, and he preached, put down your guns, love one another, live in peace. And I think that was a very powerful message that people were craving to hear, amidst all the saber rattling that was going on.
Certainly, he felt like he needed to share it. And you could even question that as to why did he want to share what he was learning from the Space Brothers?
Well, that was his purpose. The reason that space visitors or his extraterrestrial contact came to him is that you need a local representative to go out amongst the people and to bring the information forward. But what they do is they come and they elicit the help of a person whom they determine over time is trustworthy. And you have to be trustworthy and you have to be dependable, right? Because so many people in this world, you can't trust what they say. They change their minds in a minute. They sell you out even faster and throw you under the bus. And so there are very few individuals who actually are genuine. And George Adamski was completely genuine. And he did not and would not ever sell out the truth. Yeah, he had so much information that he could only tell you a fraction of it to begin with. Like he used to say with a smile, I told you the truth, I just didn't tell you all of it.
So in the end, even though as controversial as Adamski was, I think it's important. He was involved and in some ways in the center of a lot of things that we consider to be part of modern ufology. I mean, he was visited by Men in Black. Government agencies were trying to suppress him, trying to arrest him. He has photographs, he has film evidence. He described what they looked like. He described what they believed. He described where they came from. So the groundwork of the modern UFO era was laid in the 1950s and the 1960s, and that's visible in the Adamski narrative. No other contactee had as much influence as Adamski did. The fact that we're still talking about him nearly 60 years after he passed away is a testament alone as to how influential he was. But with that, I think it's time to draw this epic to a close. And I want to thank you guys for making it this far and watching this documentary all the way through. I know there's a lot of information in here, but I think it's worth discussing all of it. So with that, I bid you adieu. Stay tuned for even more Mysteries in Monsters, and I'll see you in the next one.